Okay guys, I found this code on one of Facebook groups called ASP.NET and it immediately got my attention because I can see quite a few number of problems here. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to fix these problems and how to write cleaner, more maintainable, more robust and testable code. I'm guessing this code is for a web form that might potentially look something like this. Don't worry about the stuff happening here. I'm guessing on that web form, we should have a text box where the user types the name of a book and a button, which I'm guessing when it's clicked, it will display a message saying the book is in the stock or not. I actually didn't see the web form. All I saw was this code behind file here. So let's read this code line by line and see exactly what's happening here before we can start improving it. First, we are declaring a quantity, setting it to 0. Next, we are declaring a SQL connection, and then a data reader. Finally, a query, which is trying to select the quantity of a book from book detail table, and is filtering that based on the book name, which is entered into the text box. Finally, we are instantiating a SQL command, opening the connection to the database, executing the command and reading the result. In the reader, we access the first column, which should be an int32 or an integer, which represents the quantity. If the quantity is 0, we display a message saying book is not in the stock. Otherwise, we display a message saying book is issued, which I'm not quite sure what it means. And finally, we close the data reader and the connection. So the first problem I see in this code is poor naming convention. Look at this button 1 here. What does 1 mean? How is it different from button 2 or button 3? I can't tell without looking at all the code and figuring out what does 1 represent. So I'm guessing if that's our button 1, that's trying to check the quantity or availability of a product in the stock. It would be much better if we name this button something like, instead of button 1, btn check quantity. That's more meaningful. Now I click this button here to show the events and see it automatically rename that method, which is, oops, didn't work. I don't know. Let's double click that. Okay. So I'm going to move all of this code here into this method and get rid of this. So now instead of saying button 1 click, we have btn check availability click, which is very meaningful. Same for this aqty here. Now it's kind of obvious that it's quantity, but aqty is not a very beautiful and meaningful name for a variable. Why a quantity? Why not just quantity? And instead of qty, writing the actual word quantity, it would be much cleaner. So I'm going to rename that. But see how I rename this? I'm not going to go and rename it like this. Why? Because see, these are references to that variable. And if I manually rename it here, I have to go here, copy this, and then paste it here. And who knows how many references you have here. This is very slow and really not how a good coder renames variables. A better way is you use the refactor rename command of Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, if you press Ctrl R and R, you're going to get a dialog box, which actually is not appearing here because I've got a plugin installed called ReSharper. But even if you don't have ReSharper, you can still use Visual Studio to rename variables. Basically, when you use that dialog box, you rename a variable and Visual Studio automatically renames all the references to that variable. So you don't have to manually rename each one. Now here with ReSharper, you see this little box here. And ReSharper tries to find a good name, but in this case, it's not intelligent enough to suggest the name quantity. It's suggesting int32, which is not really a good variable name. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename that and enter. See, it automatically updated the quantity variable here. So remember, Control R and R. I believe another shortcut in Visual Studio is F2. So try it and You'll love it. Similarly, this cn. cn is not a good variable name. Try to avoid acronyms and use full, meaningful names for your variables. So I'm going to rename this. Again, Control R, and see this time ReSharper realized that this is for a SQL connection, and the variable names it's suggesting is connection or a SQL connection. My preference is a shorter variable name. So I'm just going to select the first one, and ReSharper automatically updated all the references to that variable here. Same here. What does dr1 represent? How is it different from dr2? I don't know. So let's just rename that to reader. Okay. And here, S, again, S is not a good variable name. This is a query, right? So let's just rename this to query. And instead of cmd1, I'm going to use command. There you go. And that's it. I think, yeah, the code is kind of more readable now. There's just one more issue here, and that's text box 3. Again, as a reader of this code, when I look at this, I don't know what's the difference between text box 3 and text box 2, or if there is a text box 2 on the form at all. So I have to look at the whole code to figure out that text box 3 is where the user types in the name of a book. So it would be much better if we name this to txt book name instead of text box 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to again use ReSharper and rename that to txt book name. Press enter. ReSharper automatically realized that that object is used somewhere else in this file, default ASPX designer, which is the code that Visual Studio automatically generates for each of your web forms. So I've selected that, it's selected by default, and I'm going to let ReSharper to rename that for me. Now let's save everything. If I go to that designer file here, you see that ReSharper automatically renamed this for me. That's why I say always use Visual Studio or ReSharper for renaming your variables. Let's go to default. And this is the text box. I select the properties here. And here it's not renamed. I don't know why ReSharper cannot rename objects on a web form like this. So I have to manually change that to txt book name. All right, all good. Get back to our code behind. Next problem I see is this reader is declared here, but then it's used here. It's best to declare a variable closer or closest to where it's being used. This reduces the noise in your code. See, as a developer reading this code, I see you're telling me that, okay, we have quantity, we have connection, we have a reader, and then you kind of forget this, move on and go somewhere else. Then you talk about query and then command and connection open. So what happened to the reader? See, it kind of creates a mental disconnect. It would be much better if I move this line of code here, just where we need the SQL reader, but declare it and use it straight away. And see, the code is also one line shorter. All right, another thing we can do here is using the var keyword in C#. With var, you can write cleaner and shorter code. Let me show you how it works. So here, instead of using SQL connection, I can just use the keyword var. And the benefit of that is, see, with this, I'm saying SQL connection is new SQL connection. So I'm repeating this word twice here. All right. We can just use var to write less code, and it's cleaner and less noisy. Same here. We are saying SQL command and again new SQL command. So one is enough to have it here, and we can use var here. And same for reader. See, the code is getting cleaner with every step. Okay, another problem I see is this last line here, connection.close. Even though the writer of this code had good intention and they wanted to make sure that the connection to the database would be closed at the end, but unfortunately, this code is not very robust. Why? Well, see, we open the connection here, and then here we're trying to read something from the database. Now, if something goes wrong in between, for any reason, for example, maybe there was a bug in your query, or maybe the value that was returned, it wasn't an integer, anything can go wrong. In that case, if something is wrong, an exception will be thrown, which means anything after this line will not be executed. So there is no way to guarantee that the connection will be closed. How we can resolve this? We use try finally block. Let me show you how it works. So what I'm going to do is, once the connection is open, I can define a try finally. That means type in try F. This is a code snippet. So you write a little bit of code and then let Visual Studio generate more code for you. So try F and then press tab. So it automatically creates a try finally block for you. I have a course on Udemy called Visual Studio Tips and Tricks, or Double Your Coding Speed, where I cover a lot of tips on how to write code faster. And if you're interested, you can look at more code snippets and other ways to write code faster. So let's move on. I'm going to move all of this stuff here into the try block. And then I want to make sure that the reader and connection are closed no matter what. And that's the intention of the finally. So if an exception is thrown here, no matter what, this finally block will always be executed. Okay? Now, we have an error here, reader, because reader is defined in this try block, but we are using it in the finally. The problem is when we define it here in the try, the scope is applicable only here. So it has no meaning outside that block, which means we have to take this line out of the try block. So I'm going to put it here. All right. Let's look at the next problem in this code. Look at this bit here. We are trying to construct a dynamic SQL query based on what the user put in the text box. This is very dangerous because there is a security attack called SQL injection, which basically means a hacker can go and type in some weird text in your text boxes, and that would translate to some query that will be executed on your database. Let me show you what I mean by that. Imagine if I go in the text box and type in something like this. So ignore this comment bit here. Just look at this bit I'm writing. So if I type exactly this into the text box, see what is going to happen? Well, this code is trying to concatenate this string with what comes from the text box, right? So let's just simulate that here. I'm going to copy this bit here. And then I'm going to copy what the hacker puts in the text box. And finally, this bit here. So another. Actually, I can. Don't worry about it. I don't want to confuse you here. But just for demonstration, see, with that input in the text box, the query will end up looking something like this. So we're selecting quantity from book detail table, where book name is empty string or 1 is 1. Well, 1 is 1 is always true, which means this query will be somehow executed. Don't worry about what is returned, but here's the tricky part. With semicolon, we can batch queries, which means this would be also executed on your database, which means if the hacker puts that string in the text box, they can easily drop one of your tables. Using a similar technique, they can go ahead and write a query that would create an administrator account on your database, something like this, insert into members or users, with some values, blah, blah, blah. Now, it also requires a little bit of intelligence and guessing the schema of your database. I'm not a hacking expert, but I know there are ways for them to even extract the schema of your database, know exactly what tables you have, what columns you have, and based on that, they can construct a query that will give them the complete control of your application and potentially your server, depending on the permissions. So the lesson here is never, ever, ever trust what the user puts in the text box, and based on that, just go ahead and create a query. The way to resolve this is to use parameterized queries, which means instead of concatenating strings here, we're going to change our query to something more kind of static, which would be like this. So this is a parameter that is prefixed with the @ sign. So what the user puts in the text box will end up being as a parameter here. And this is the actual query. So nothing else will be executed on the database. So if I go and put some weird string here, that will go here, and when SQL Server runs that query, it doesn't see this text as yet another query. So this is the actual query that will be executed. Now, in order to use parameterized queries, the first thing you need to do is define a parameter in your query, and then you need to add that parameter in your command object. So here, after I define my command, I'm going to go ahead and say command.parameters.add. Now, the parameters to the add method, you can define a parameter name, the DB type, and size and column. Or I would say this is the best overload. So you pass a SQL parameter object. So here I'm going to create a SQL parameter object and give it a name. The name should be exactly what I put here, book name, and a value, which would be what we put into the text box. So that was txt bookname.text. Right? So with this, we can get rid of our SQL injection attack, and our code will be more secure. Let me get rid of these comments here. Okay, let's see another way to improve this code. See, this method here, btn check availability, is doing too many things. It's trying to access the database here and read the quantity, and then it's trying to show a message to the user. This bit, accessing the database, should not be the responsibility of a method in your code behind file. Your code behind file belongs to your web form, this web form. And the web form is in the presentation layer of your software, which is what the user sees. This bit here is about data access. So data access code should not be in the presentation layer. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to move all of this code into a separate method just to show you a step-by-step refactoring technique. So basically, what we need is a method that gets as a parameter or argument the name of a book, and then go in the database and return the quantity, right? That code should not know nothing about what is going to be displayed in the user interface, like this response.write. All it needs to know is how to get the data from the database, right? So let me go ahead here. I'm going to declare it as private, and I want it to return the quantity, which would be an integer. And I'm going to call this method get product quantity from stock stock. And as the parameter, I'm going to define a string, which is book name. And see, I'm creating methods that have meaningful names and meaningful parameters. Anyone looking at this code can immediately tell what this method is doing without going and reading every line of this method. And that's the key. You should write code that is meaningful, like a story, like a newspaper, like a book. You don't have to, a developer does not have to read every line of your code to know what's happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy everything here into this method. Now this method, as I said, is about data access, so it should not know anything about writing something on the web form. So basically, once we read the quantity, that's it. We don't need to know anything else. Finally, we close the reader and the connection and just return the quantity. right? So let's review again. This method creates a connection, query, command, opens the connection, reads the data from the database and return it. It has one single responsibility. It's not doing too many things. Then I can go ahead and refactor this code, and instead of going to the database and doing everything here, I can ask this method to get the data for me. And then if the quantity is 0, I can just display this message, otherwise this message. So let's do that. I'm going to define a var quantity and ask this method get product quantity from stock, and then just pass the txt bookname.text. And at this point, we've got the quantity. It's either 0 or not. If it's 0, we're going to display this message, otherwise this message. And we can get rid of everything else here. So let me clean up this code. See, now this method is much cleaner. It has only a few lines of code, and its responsibility is purely to display a proper message to the user. And this code has also few lines of code. Well, it's a little bit more than my personal taste, and I will show you shortly how we can even make this a little bit shorter, but it has only one single responsibility, and that is to get the data from the database. Okay, let's look at this code again. This query, we can just grab this and put that here where it's used, because this is the only place we have used that query. And we don't necessarily need to store it in a separate variable. So I'll just put that here and get rid of this extra variable here. All right, other things we can do to improve this code is this hard-coded connection string here. It's not a good thing. Why? Because if the connection string changes, we have to go here and change it here and recompile the application. Now you might wonder when the connection string changes. Well, it's quite possible that in real-world scenarios you have a development server, a test server, and a production server. And each of these servers require a different connection string. You cannot recompile your application every time you want to deploy it to one of these servers. So a better way is to use a configuration file where you can store the connection strings for each environment, and then your source code would just read the data from the configuration file. In the case of this web forms application, we're going to store the connection string in web.config. So I'm going to open up web.config here. Under here at the beginning, just after configuration and config sections, you see these connection strings. So I can define a connection string here, use the add, give it a name. Let's call it, I don't know, bookstore, for example, bookstore. And the value, the connection string would be exactly what we put here. So I'm going to cut that and paste that here. Now, this is just an XML. It doesn't require a compilation. And when we deploy this application to each environment, whether it's dev, test, or production, we will have a separate web.config for that environment. And the application code will be exactly the same. Now, how can we read the data from connection string? We use the configuration manager class, like this. So I type in configuration manager. Now I'm using ReSharper, and ReSharper automatically knows that this class is in a namespace called system.configuration. So I can just hit enter, and ReSharper automatically adds that namespace here for me. If you are not using ReSharper, you probably have to type it here, and Visual Studio doesn't recognize that. Then you right click, and there will be some menu on the top here that is called resolve namespace, something like that. I strongly recommend you to install ReSharper because it makes your coding a lot easier. All right, let's go ahead. So configuration manager is a class. I'm gonna go to to connection strings, and this has an indexer. I can specify the name of my connection string, which is in this case bookstore, and that returns a connection string object, which is equivalent to this object here. So that object has a property called connection string, which is the actual string here. So in order to get that, we come back here, we get the connection string object, and then we access the connection string property. So this is what we'll put here in the SQL connection. I would argue that it would be also cleaner to, instead of writing this raw query here, you use a stored procedure. For example, you would have a stored procedure called getQuantity, which gets an input, which is the name of the book, and returns the quantity. I'm going to leave that exercise to you because I want to talk about more fundamental issues in this course. So let's see what else we can do to improve this code. One thing that just got my attention is this book name. We declared it, but we never used it. How do I know? Well, ReSharper is kind of graying out this for me. Look, this is white and this is gray, which makes me think this is never used. So when I look here at the parameter, I can see that it's still using the txt book name. I don't want this method to be dependent on that text box because shortly I will show you that I'm going to move this somewhere else. So let's just use book name here and see now it became white. Earlier I told you that the data access code should not be in the presentation layer, which means this code does not belong to this code behind file for this web page. What we can do is to move this to a separate class. Let's say we're going to create a class called stock that would be responsible for getting the stock or updating the stock from the database. Now, there are various ways to model that and create layers for your application, but it's going to be beyond the scope of this video because this code is, I think, for beginner level .NET developer, and I don't want to confuse you with too much complexity. So what I would suggest is, at a minimum, go to your project here, right click, add a new folder, call it maybe services. So here I'm going to create a new class, add a class. I'm going to call this stock service. And then I'm going to move this code here into that class. Let me also show you a quick shortcut here. See, I can go and use the mouse to select this and cut and paste, or there is a quicker way. So anywhere here, I can press Ctrl and M twice. The method gets collapsed. Now I can press Ctrl X, and then I can press Ctrl and Tab, and this shows all the open windows in my Visual Studio project. So I'm going to go to stock service, and then I come here and then Ctrl V to paste the code. Right? It's much easier when you use your keyboard. Again, in my Visual Studio course on Udemy, I talk about all these things. So if you want to learn how to write code fast, you can take my course and get a lot out of it. Now, when I paste this code, ReSharper is automatically detecting that this SQL connection here is in the system.data.SQL client namespace, which is not added here. So I'm just going to click this or press Alt and Enter as the ReSharper suggests. So there you go. And similarly, configuration manager is in system.configuration namespace, which does not exist here. Again, I rely on ReSharper to automatically fix this for me. So the shortcut is Alt and Enter. There you go. Which means now I can go back to my code behind file. Again, I'm going to use Ctrl and Tab. Go here. See, this class is much cleaner now. Now, this method does not exist in this class anymore, and it's in our stock service. So we need a reference to the stock service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private field here, stock service, give it a meaningful name. Now, private fields should always be prefixed with an underscore. And see, ReSharper is automatically suggesting 3 names for me. I'm thinking stock service is more meaningful in this case. And then in the constructor of this class, we can initialize this field. And finally here, we can use that reference stock service.get product quantity from stock. It's still complaining. Okay, because that method was originally declared as private, and now ReSharper is telling it's Visual Studio that is complaining. It says cannot access private method get product quantity from stock here. So I'm going to go back to my stock service and change that to public. Now Control Tab, back here, the problem is resolved. Also, another thing that got my attention is this method here is a little bit too long for my taste. I would like it to be a little bit shorter. See, we are using stock service, so it's obvious that we are dealing with the stock. So it would be more, it would be cleaner if we just name this method get product quantity instead of get product quantity from stock, right? Now, how can we rename this? I told you earlier, Control R and R again. So Control R and R, and then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this extra 2 words, get product quantity. And guess what? ReSharper automatically renames it here, as well as in the stock service where we define the method. And another tip I show you is look at these namespaces here. The first 2 are gray, which means they're not used, as well as the last 2. Now, with Visual Studio, you can right-click this and go Organize Using and select Remove and Sort, which cleans up your code. Or you can install a plugin called VS Commands, which automatically cleans up your code whenever you save your code file. So in this case, if I press Ctrl and S to save this code file, see, it automatically removes that. I don't even have to touch my mouse. Okay, I think this code is almost okay. Let's get back to our code behind file. See, the intention of this code is very clear now. Instead of having button 1 or text box 3 or seeing all the details of connection and command, I can immediately see this button, when clicked, it tries to check availability. It goes to stock service, which gets the product quantity from the database, returns it here. If it's 0, this is the message we display, otherwise this is the message. I don't care how the stock service gets the product quantity from the database. It's the implementation detail of that service. If there is a bug in that code, I can just go here, click this, and press F12 to jump to that method, and then read the details of this method. So the lesson is your code should be clean such that a reader looks at a method name like this and knowing what's happening without going and looking at every line of that method. Similar here, see? B10 check availability. I don't really necessarily need to look at this detail. I can just look at the method name and say, okay, this is checking the availability of the product. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like me to review your code, please contact me. I'm more than happy to help you. Thank you for watching.